Randolph Miller, ex-slave and editor of The Blade, a nationally syndicated newspaper. According to Standard History of Chattanooga by Charles D. McGuffey, Randolph Miller was born a slave in Fluvanna County, Virginia in 1842 and belonged to Dr. Robert W. Curran. When he was 9 years old, he was taken to Georgia with a drove, or the quote, drove of Negroes and sold to Andrew Jackson Miller. When General William T. Sherman's army marched through Georgia, they took young Randolph Miller with them. Miller came to Chattanooga in 1864 as a ward of the army and stayed on after the Civil War. He worked several odd jobs, finally landing a job with the Chattanooga Daily Gazette. His job was to turn the press by muscular power. He later went to the American Union to try out his skill as a pressman operating a Washington press. Miller returned to Chattanooga after the Daily Times was established. He worked for the Daily Times and the Commercial, finally landing a job with the Times as a pressman. He was taught to use a power press by George M. Day, a white man, and after he learned the inner workings of a newspaper, he soon launched his own paper. All right. He called his paper The Blade. Now, I wonder if the movie The Blade was named after this. Who knows? They might have done some research back then. Who knows? Although Miller was considered eccentric and illiterate, he soon became one of the most quoted editors in the entire country. Thousands of his quotes, which were known as gems from the Blade and flashes from the Blade, were reprinted. Now I'm going to read that again. All right. He called his paper The Blade. Although Miller was considered eccentric and illiterate, he soon became one of the most quoted editors in the entire country. Thousands of his quotes, which were known as or called, his quotes were called gems from the Blade, or they were called flashes from the Blade. They were reprinted. So other people in other newspapers were reprinting his quotes. His quotes were so fire and so gangster, they had to take it and reprint it. All right, putting it like that. Miller was a fiery, outspoken man. He was like an early prototype for the civil rights leaders of the 1960s and 1970s, and he was certainly not afraid to speak out against the prejudice, injustice, and segregation theories of the early days. All right, keep that in mind. He was not afraid to speak out against prejudice, injustice, and segregation theories of the early days. All right. In July 1905, he joined forces with other Chattanooga African-American businessmen to launch a streetcar boycott against the Jim Crow laws regarding transportation. Not knowing that this boycott would be considered an important move for early Tennessee civil rights and would be celebrated in the history books over 100 years later. In 1905, segregation laws, or Jim Crow laws, as they were called, had already begun spreading across the state. Laws were already in place regarding the railway system, and when they spread to the streetcar systems of Tennessee in 1905, African Americans throughout the state began to speak of organizing boycotts in protest. In fact, there was not a major city in the state of Tennessee that did not experience some type of public display from the African American communities and their reaction to the extension of Jim Crow. Chattanooga was no exception. Miller and other Chattanooga African American businessmen planned to start their own bus company so that African Americans could be transported with dignity and respect. All right, Chattanooga, you need to know this history. A lot of kids out there is wilding out, from my understanding, and yet you have this rich history of Black businessmen wanting to put together bus companies and standing up against injustices. All right. You need to think about that. All right, I'm gonna read that again. Miller and other Chattanooga African American businessmen planned to start their own bus company so that African Americans could be transported with dignity and respect. They began by originating a system of hack lines that traveled between the city and the outlying Black communities of Churchville, St. Elmo, Fort Cheatham, and Tannery Flats. A lot of you know where that's at right now, or where it was at that time. The first day of operation fell on July 16th, with what some in the city described as 3 vehicles of sorry appearance that carted members of African American community about the city. It is unknown whether the vehicles were as sorry as they were described, but it is known that Miller and the other hack operators found a loyal patronage among Chattanooga African Americans. The hack line vehicles ran almost to capacity, and Miller and his partners were so encouraged by this patronage that they applied for a charter on August 29. Their charter named their new transportation company the Transfer Omnibus Motor Car Company. With an initial investment of $10,000, they devised a workable plan to replace the hack lines with several 40-passenger motor cars. Of course, they would need much more than the initial $10,000 investment to obtain the motor cars. They had thought to follow a similar plan as the one that had found success in Nashville, Tennessee. They would rely on small investments from a large number of Black stockholders and would obtain the money they needed to make the purchases. Unfortunately, many of Chattanooga's African American leaders of that day were slow to give their public support to this bold venture, and this greatly hindered the success of the new transportation company. Still, all was not lost. The 4 hack lines had a steady flow of customers. These customers have found their treatment on the public streetcars unbearable and preferred to pay the 5-cent fare on the hack lines. This source of income could have eventually helped the businessmen reach their goal, but white officials felt that Miller and his partners were promoting the spirit of resentment, craziness, and they made no secret about the fact that they wanted to close off these funds. Then, County Humane Officer W.J. Eddings announced that he intended to prosecute the hack operators for, quote, working old, worn out animals from early morning until late at night. So basically, they just coming up with excuses to try to stop these Black men from their business from prospering. Basically, what it came down to. All right. Okay, from hacking worn out and only half feeding them. And it became glaringly apparent that the company would not be able to stand under such opposition. The dream of an independent transportation system had been effectively crushed, but Randolph Miller was not afraid to speak out. In an October 1905 issue of The Blade, he said, "They have taken our part of the library. They have moved our school to the frog pond. They have passed the Jim Crow laws. They have knocked us out of the jury box. They have played the devil generally. And what in thunder more will they do? No one knows." So Randolph Miller was a guy who spoke up, wasn't afraid to speak up against a lot of folks, a lot of injustice. So let me go on. And so the Transfer Omnibus Motor Car Company died away before its founders could determine whether it would be able to meet its high aspirations. The fiery Randolph Miller died in 1915, but the Chattanooga Times continued to reprint excerpts from his editorials. Today, Randolph M. Miller's historical marker is proudly displayed in front of the beautiful Bessie Smith Museum, African American History Museum, located on MLK Boulevard in Chattanooga, Tennessee. All right, let me show you this picture right here. Chattanooga, Tennessee, y'all need to know your history, man. So here's the marker here regarding Randolph Miller. All right. So Randolph Miller was a person who definitely spoke up against any injustice, wasn't afraid at all, wasn't afraid of white people, wasn't afraid to speak up against what white people were doing. All right, so that's Randolph Miller.